Namaste, and a very warm welcome to you all to the seventh session of Bilva. I am Mauli Baviskar, and you're all welcome to Damru Studio. Bilva is our annual yoga festival that we celebrate every year with different themes. We come up and then invite speakers for workshops and talks like these. And so last year, the theme for Bilva was Bharatiya Parampara, rebuilding modern India on the strong foundations of Sanatana Dharma. On the similar line, but this year, something that I felt was more important was the cultural misappropriation of yoga that keeps happening more often than maybe earlier. But so this time we decided to invite speakers and talk and discuss on the theme of cultural appropriation of yoga, necessity to embrace the inherent Indianness of the yogic tradition. So this is the line of thought and intention on which we will be conducting the talk today, as well as the earlier talks and the ones which will follow. Bilva festival happens every year under the wing of Damru Foundation. So a little bit brief I'll give you about the foundation. Our Damru Foundation is a public trust founded by Damru Yoga and Sound Therapy Studio with the aim to promote and implement traditional yogic sciences in current times and increase awareness about wellness and harmony in society, while primarily focusing on serving that segment of the society who are in dire need of support for their holistic wellness but cannot afford it. So your contributions to Damru Foundations will be used towards various activities that focus on physical, mental, and emotional well-being of individuals, groups, schools, and communities. So if you wish to support our efforts, consider contributing to Damru Foundation either by making a one-time payment or recurring mode of payments. You can find the link to the payment options in the description box below this video. Your contributions will help us together to support more people in the society as well as bring more such valuable content and speakers to share their knowledge with us. Coming to our speaker today, I will invite Ms. Nritya Jagannathan. Welcome, ma'am.
Namaste.
Warm welcome to Damru. Um, she has been a strong support and an integral part of Bilwa. Before we start, I'll just briefly introduce Nritya ma'am to you all. Nritya Jagannathan. Ms. Nritya Jagannathan is a senior yoga therapist from Krishnamacharya tradition. With over 19 years of teaching experience, she is currently the director of KYM Institute of Yoga Studies, Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram, Chennai, India. This is the training and certification wing of KYM. She has traveled extensively around the world to teach yoga and Vedic chanting and is a certified therapist from the International Association of Yoga Therapists, CIAYT. A classical Bharatanatyam dancer as well, Nritya is passionate about Indian culture and yoga philosophy. She is also the editor-in-chief of Darshanam, the quarterly journal of yoga and yoga chikitsa of the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram. I have been learning from her in person at the Mandiram as well as online since a few years now. And I think all her students would vouch for what a wonderful teacher that she is. She's been an integral part of Damru, especially Bilwa, since its inception. So there are so many people, who support us in their own ways in our journeys. At times, we don't need support, which is, say, financial support or emotional support, ethical or moral support. All we need at times is someone who can just hold space for us with love. And I feel that is exactly what she has been to me. We may not interact every day, but then I know that she's there as a friend, as a guide, as a teacher. And today, being Guru Purnima, I offer my namaskarams to her on this very special day. So, while last year she talked about yoga of sound, we did touch upon the topic of importance of symbols and symbolisms in our culture. So this year we delve deeper into that topic, as her subject of discussion today is, it's a very beautiful topic, Hridaya, at the heart of yogic and Vedic metaphors. So we're very delighted to have Nritya ma'am with us today. Once again, very warm welcome, ma'am.
Namaste. Yes, thank you, Mauli, for inviting me. This is year 3 at Bilva, and always delighted to be a part of this festival. And the pranams that you offered me, I offer to my teacher. I'm only an instrument, and we just pass on something that we've been blessed to receive. Because truly, I think I'll come to it in my speech. I don't think any of us can qualify as gurus, because what a guru represents is something truly special, which is also a part of my talk today. So, but we've been blessed with a remarkable Guru Parampara, who have brought alive such wisdom, and I think it's so important that, especially the topic of this series, in terms of cultural appropriation, misappropriation, sometimes abuse, and therefore the necessity to reclaim what truly is culture, I think, is of extreme importance in the present day scenario, as knowledge of yoga, Vedanta, Veda grows beyond the boundaries of India. I think it's so important for us to be anchored in what truly the heart of this culture is. So let me start with a prayer and then I'll move on. वागर्थाविव सम्पृक्तौ वागर्थः प्रतिपत्तये जगतः पितरौ वन्दे पार्वती परमेश्वरौ गुरुभ्यस्तद्गुरुभ्यश्च नमो वाकमधीमहे वृणीमहे च तत्राद्यौ दंपती जगतां पति व्यासाय विष्णुरूपाय व्यासरूपाय विष्णवे नमो वै ब्रह्मनिधये वासिष्ठाय नमो नमः। श्रीकृष्णवागीशयतीश्वराभ्यां सम्प्राप्तचक्राङ्कणभाष्यसारम् श्रीनूत्नरङ्गेन्द्रयतौ समर्पितस्वं श्रीकृष्णमार्यं गुरुवर्यमीडे विरोधे कार्तिके मासे शतताराकृतोदयम् योगाचार्यं कृष्णमार्यं गुरुवर्यमहं भजे कृष्णसूरीदयापात्रं ज्ञानवैराग्यभूषणं श्रीमद्वेङ्कटनाथार्यं वन्देऽहं योगदेशिकम् श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः। When we speak about metaphor, in many ways, I must say that so much of the wisdom that has come to us through the ages, from time immemorial, has been so beautifully draped within the garb of metaphor. And unfortunately, what happens in our modern 21st century interpretations is that we see the covering, but we don't take the time to look at what lies within. And unfortunately, this is our loss, because there is such a world of beauty. It is so easy to dismiss stories, to dismiss certain very beautiful comparisons on the surface. Unfortunately, in the context of modern pseudo scholarship, where we rely heavily on translations, the problem is that there are certain aspects of Sanskrita that cannot be translated. And further, that given the nuances of Sanskrita, there are so many ways in which words, phrases, shlokas, mantras can be interpreted. And one needs to visit them in that context. Otherwise, not only do we do the interpretation itself a disservice, but we are also doing ourselves a disservice because we don't realize that our understanding is very superficial at best and therefore very misunderstood. When you look at Vedic and yogic symbolism, we see that there are multiple layers. According to the vision of the Vedas, there's only one Atman, otherwise known as Brahman, the source that is ever expanding, invoked in different ways. Now, the rishis were able to see that one principle of unity that is underlying the diversity of this universe. And this is an experience very deep, very intimate, born of their powers of tapas. And this experience, intuitive wisdom, is referred to by Yaskacharya as Shrutimati Buddhi, a very unique, special wisdom filled with supranormal capacities to hear, to see, and to reflect. And so, in the communication of those deep experiences, very often worldly and often commonplace images are used to give expression to that which is beyond word, which is beyond description. Because that is the experience of Brahman, of the Supreme Atman, which underpins all phenomenal diversity. And so the Vedic seer has this lofty perspective, powered by their spiritual power of tapas. And so, in their vision, very unique vision, everything, both outside and inside, manifest as one seamless continuity. No plurality, no dichotomy. And so we see that the Vedic view is an integral view. There are no boundaries, there are no demarcations, there are no differences. And so, what we see as the sun, the one sun can be seen by the ordinary person, by all of us, as something that rises in the east, sets in the west, defining us by in a temporal context. And so we see this simply from a visual perspective. The astrophysicist might see the sun as a main sequence star that generates its energy through a process of nuclear fusion of hydrogen nuclei into helium. The philosopher might see the rise of the sun as darkness giving way to light, as ignorance giving way to knowledge. The biologist might see the sun as the source for the plants to produce chlorophyll. The Vedic seer sees all this, but more importantly, sees that sun within as the very self, as the heart of the whole, of the human. And at the same time, sees this Atma present in all the other loci outside, both within and without. And therein lies that magnificence of Vedic symbolism, of yogic symbolism. And how do you understand this? To truly comprehend, you need to resonate at the same spiritual wavelength as the mantra drashtas. Because for all the rest of us, we are seeing only a part of the story. And so if we have to understand truly, we have to undergo our samyama. We need to do our tapas. Because these visions are not the creation of an ordinary plane of consciousness. They are remarkable. And what is experienced is presented not directly. They are presented indirectly, suggestively, through symbols, multiple layers. And very often the verbal representation of an experience is impacted by the depth of the experience itself, which is why so often you see our writers, the masters, breaking forth into the most beautiful poetry. You need to unravel the threads to go deep. You have to unravel the thoughts, the words, the language to understand that all these metaphors are but allegory. They are metaphor They are limited human ways of communicating that which is suprahuman, that which is transcendent, that which is truly remarkable, which is both most complex and yet most simple. Simple, accessible, because it lies within us. Let me share my slides at this point. Hridaya, at the heart of yogic metaphor. When Mauli asked me to speak in this festival, this was what came up instantaneously. Because truly the heart of this tradition of the Bharatiya Sanatana Samskriti is something splendid. It's something to be delighted in. Every little bit has to be delighted in. You have to consume it. As there's this beautiful song that says, Pibare Rama Rasam. In that manner, you have to literally drink of this rasa that is present, so beautiful, that is present throughout Indian thought, in philosophy, in literature, in art, in music, in sculpture, in every stream that comes from the Vedic river. You'll see this beauty, that vibrant resonance of metaphor. When we look at interpretations, we see how do these symbols manifest. See, what you see are the external symbol. This is outermost. Unfortunately, most of us don't go beyond. But if you look at where the symbol is coming from, we must remember it traces back to a core value system. What is the value system of the Bharatiya Samskriti? It is this notion of Brahman. One Brahman, Ekam Sat, Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti. There's one truth. It is experienced and spoken of in so many ways. This is the core value system. As a way of concretizing this value system are rituals that are created. So many rituals, the Yajna tradition, the Agnihotra tradition, so many cultural practices that are created around these value systems, carried forth by personalities. This is why we revere a Rama, we revere a Krishna. This is why Arjuna becomes so important. This is why the personalities that we see in our Puranas come alive, because the stories they have to tell us are not just stories, they are stories that carry forth these value systems. It is like bathing in the Ganga. You can bathe in the Ganga at Rishikesh. You can go all the way to Gangotri. You can bathe in the Ganga at Varanasi or at Prayagraj. Still the same Ganga, but the experience is very different. But all the paths lead to that goal. That is the beauty, that there are so many personalities that speak, their lives speak of these values. And unfortunately, we see them merely as heroes, as heroines, as characters, not realizing what they represent. It is through them that the symbols are established, and over time, these symbols come into practice. This is how culture itself evolves. But where there is culture, there is symbol. Where there is symbol, there is symbolism. The symbolism is never at the surface. One needs to go all the way. You have to plumb the depths to understand the underpinning value system that is at the base of the symbol. When we look at interpretation, most of Vedic and yogic symbols are interpreted at three levels. You have the Adi Bhautika, which is of the material plane. It is commonplace, it's ordinary, and this is how you see it as connected to the world of elements. There is the Adi Daivika, where it's elevated to divine, and there is the Adhyatmika, which is truly transcendent. If you were to take the case of the sun, we know that the sun has got the fancy, not just of people in the Vedic times, but since time immemorial. Now, Surya is understood as literally the source that gives us food, that is responsible for photosynthesis. So, at the Adi Bhautika level, revered as the source of life. Adi Daivika, elevated to the divine as Surya Devata. But as Adhyatmika, that which illumines the sun is the light that is also of the consciousness that illumines this embodied Jivatma. That is the Adhyatmika interpretation. There is one source, as the Mundaka Upanishad says. There is that is Adrishyam. Agrahyam, agotram, avarnam, achakshusrotra tadapanipadam, nityam vibhum sarvagatam susukshmam, tad avyayam yat bhutayonim paripashyanti dhiraha. It says the wise, the dhira, perceive there is one source. What is this? It is invisible, agrahyam, beyond being grasped. It has no origin. It has no attributes. No eyes, no ears, no hands, no feet. It is eternal, all-pervasive, and yet subtlest beyond measure. It is limitless in its expression. It is this one source, Bhuta Yonim, that manifests in such magnificent ways through the symbols that we explore. This is a fundamental idea of the Brahmanda and the Pindanda. Brahmanda, as is the macro, is the micro. Pindanda is this body. And so there is this constant resonance, as above, so below, as without, so within. This is the common thread that runs through all Indian thought and philosophy. This is one of the most beautiful symbols, that of the inverted Ashwatha tree. You see it appear in the Kathopanishad as well as in the Bhagavad Gita. There is this ancient Ashwatha, Urdhva Molo Va Shakham, Esho Ashwatha Sanatana. It's an eternal tree. This is Brahman. This is pure. Tadeva Shukram, Tad Brahma, Tadeva Amritamuchyate. This is eternal. And it is here that all the worlds rest. None can transcend. And this that we see, our life, is nothing but a manifestation of that source. What is this Ashwatha? Ashwatha indicates that which is eternal, that which is not today, that which is always changing, that which is ephemeral. This represents samsara. It is phenomenal existence in this world. And so you see, this is an inverted tree. The roots are above, the branches and the leaves below. The tree itself is imperishable, timeless, and yet unsteady. So samsara, our life, originates in this unmanifest Brahman, the eternal Brahman, but it branches into materialization. Typically, the Ashwatha is like a people or sort of belonging to the banyan family. The sap comes from above, branches are sent below. And this samsara is like that. We derive our sustenance from that which is the source. We see that the Ashwatha itself is a symbol. It shows us how the canvas of Prakriti manifests, and the self-expressive nature of our life is indicated by the leaves of the tree. And we see that there are Vedic mantras. The leaves indicate the mantras, the various stotras, smritis, that show us how we need to live. And so we see this Ashwatha as the tree of samsara, rooted in the Brahman, and yet branching into the world of matter, innumerable branches. But this tree is constantly changing. It's like a mirage, not dependable, perpetuates the cycle of birth, of life, of aging, decay, death, and then loss. And so you see, it comes from the source, Hiranyagarbha, manifests as knowledge. And then you see that the skanda, the trunk, is formed by the subtlest forms of all creatures. It is watered by the desires. The buds are the objects of the buddhi, the senses, and the leaves are the teachings of the Vedas. And the flowers, the fruits are the virtues. These are what fructify the actions, the fruits of our own thoughts. And this is how we live. And this tree is the abode of so many creatures who experience so many different emotions. And this is the tree that sways this way and that. It is shaken by the winds of kama and karma. It has to be cut down, says the Bhagavad Gita. And how do you do it? Through Brahmajnana. You need to go back to the source. The Bhagavad Gita says the same thing in chapter 15. And it says that there is this one, this is the source of samsara. And then it spreads because of the samskaras and vasanas are what binding us to choices, good and evil, leading to consequences that are punya and apunya. It has no form. You can't see its form, but you have to cut it. Ashwathamenam suvirudha moolam asanga shastrena dridhena chitva. You have to tear it apart, render it impotent by the acts of asanga, vairagyam. And what do we do? What is the purpose of our life? Return to the source. Tat padam parimargitavyam yasmin gatana nivartanti bhuyaha tameva chadyam purusham prapadye yata pravritti prasrita purani. because you have to go back to that source from which eternal activity comes forth. This is the purpose of our life. One of the most beautiful symbols that we see, representing our source, rooted in the Brahman, and yet so tangled up in the branches, in the leaves of samsara. You have to break the tree to go back to the source. This is one such very beautiful metaphor. Another appears is the story of the embodied divine that comes in the Taittiriya Upanishad, Brahmanandavalli, where it says there is this Brahman, that is the source, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, Yo Veda Nihitam Guhayam Parame Vyoman Soshnute Sarvan Kaman Saha Brahmana Vipaschiteti. There is this Brahman that has to be known. If you know it, there is nothing else. This is the highest knowledge. But how do you know it? You have to understand how Brahman evolves. And the Upanishad tells us there is the evolution from Akasha to Vayu to Agni to Apa to Prithvi. From the 5 elements emerge the plants, Oshadi. These in turn become the source of Annam, nourishment. Annat Purushaha. This Purusha, this form is made up of this food that we consume. This food is verily birthed out of the 5 elements. It is for this reason that the Indian Samskriti says Annam Brahma, because that morsel of food, every grain of food, embodies within itself the timeless, eternal Brahma. And we have within ourselves the 5 elements that make up our body. And when we realize this, you realize, Sa Yascha Ayam Purushe, that Purusha, that self that is within me, Yascha Asau Aditya, is also that Brahman which illumines the sun. Sa Ekaha, they are one, they are no different. This is the repeated thread of thought that runs through all such metaphor. Another lovely imagery comes through the Jivatma and the Paramatma represented as the 2 birds. Dvasuparna Sayuja Sakhaya Samanam Vriksham Parishasva Jate Tayoranya Pippalam Swadvat Yanash Ashnan Anyo Abhichaka Shiti. This is the Mundaka Upanishad. It says there are 2 beautiful birds, so beautiful in their plumage, and they are perched on the same branch. One consumes the fruits of the tree, relishing it, and the other merely looks on. They are seated on the same tree. One in delusion grieves its impotence, but the other realizes the supreme, and in that moment it is free. You see this in the Rigveda Samhita, you see it in the Mundaka Upanishad, you see it in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. These birds signify the Jivatma and the Paramatma. The Jivatma is that pure consciousness, yet limited by body, mind, attachment, action, karma, because of avidya. The Paramatma is the very source of this Jivatma. They are inseparable, they are combined. And the embodied soul is a part of the Paramatma, like the rays of the sun are inseparable from the sun itself. The tree they occupy is the body, and they are companions. One is eating the fruits, the other watches. The former represents the Jivatma, the latter the Paramatma. In the Jivatma, you have an entire range of experiences, happy, unhappy, bitter, sweet, sad. And this is the bird that's tasting these fruits. The Paramatma merely watches. It is possible to distance oneself from the grief or from the happiness and seek that lasting ananda by aligning with the self that is just watching, to align with the witness. Paramatma and Jiva are present here, they're present in the world, in everything, they're present inside of us. The unattached bird is literally the self, the soul that's seated in our heart. It's present everywhere. The bird that eats the fruits is the soul that is trapped. And so we see such a beautiful metaphor, speaking of the purpose. What do you need to do? You can either engage and get trapped repeatedly in cycles of birth, life, and death, or one can renunciate. What the Bhagavad Gita presents as Jnana Karma Sannyasa, let go. Let go of the ownership of action, let go of ownership of the fruits, merely act as yajna. And then the karma doesn't bind you. That is when you align with the self that is within. And so we see that you can cling to the karma phala because of your attachment and then go through the cycle, repeated cycles of karma, sanchita karma, prarabdha karma, sanchiyamana karma, or you can be aligned to the other bird, unperturbed witness. That is the bird that realizes its nature, and then it's free. The similar idea, the coming together of Purusha and Prakriti, this seems to be the constant. Ishvara and Ishwari, represented as Brahman and Mahashakti in the certain tantric traditions. In the yoga and Sankhya traditions, Purusha and Prakriti. We have this verse from the very beautiful idea. Ajam ekam lohita shukla krishnam bhakvik praja trijamanam sarupaha ajohi eko jushamananu shete jahatyenam bhukta bhogam ajo anyaha. There is one unborn. This is the eternal Prakriti. She is white, black and red, made up of the three gunas, Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. She births many creatures. With her lies another unborn who is lying with her. Another unborn abandons when all her enjoyments have been enjoyed. Very beautiful, very deep verse from the Upanishad. It says, the three colors here represent Prakriti, made up of the three gunas. The evolutes are her multiple offspring. The unborn male who lies with her is the Purusha. The other who abandons her, the Purusha is the Jivatma, tied because of karma. But there is the other, the liberated soul, the one that is in alignment with the Supreme Consciousness, who abandons her, realizing that all that is of Prakriti is only the source of Dukkham. And so you see this idea of Purusha Prakriti represented in so many ways. You see it as Kali, the one who devours time. She dances on Shiva. You also see her as Lalita Tripurasundari, the goddess of the three worlds. In both cases, you see how Prakriti is presented as the active component. Purusha is the inert witness. What a beautiful representation. You see this in the images, but we don't see the connection. Ajam, Ekam, Lohita, Shukla, Krishnam. There's this one unborn, this Prakriti that manifests. What is unmanifest is the Purusha, but that is the base. That thought is represented in so many images. You see it in the Ardhanari form of Shiva. You see it in the Lakshmi Narayana form of Mahavishnu and Mahalakshmi. You see it in the Linga and the Yoni. And you see it in commonplace images, in the little rangolis that decorate our doorsteps. The principle is the same, that of the Purusha and the Prakriti coming together, of Brahman and Shakti coming together to birth the universe. We see also sound as metaphor. As the Taittiriya Upanishad says, Omiti Eka Aksharam Brahma. There is this one syllable, Om. It represents the eternal Brahma. You have the Nadabindu Upanishad, which gives us this beautiful idea of the Omkara as a bird. And it says, A is the bird's right wing. U is the left. Upanishad representing the Upanishad. Is the tail. And the Ardhamatra is the head. The three qualities, Rajasic and Tamasic qualities, are the lower part. Sattva is its main body. Dharma and Adharma are the eyes. You have the words represented. Bhuhu in the feet, Bhuvaha in the knees, Suvaha in the loins, Mahaha in the navel of the bird. In the heart is Janaha, Tapaha in the throat, Satyaloka in the center of the forehead. And then you have the Matra, the mantra that is beyond, that transcends. And the one who is an adept, the yogi, sits on this Hamsa. What is this Hamsa? It's the Omkara. Om is the representation. Where you have visual, you also have auditory metaphors. And Om represents the totality of creation. And so you have the idea of Agni, Vayu, and Surya as the Devatas that are invoked in the Omkara. And this Upanishad says you sit astride the Hamsa, the swan that is the Omkara. And this will lead you to the experience of the Brahman. Now, Om is not just, see, this is one of the most commonly misunderstood terms, sounds, associated only being Hindu. The idea is that the notion of an Omkara is beyond religion. It transcends religion. It transcends all language. It transcends this limited world of form. Because as a sound, if you look at how sound is produced, the first sound that one can articulate from the base of the throat is A. It comes here from the guttural region. This represents beginning. O. is where the sound has moved, you articulate it from the palatal region. Represents culmination, closure, because after that, once the lips are pressed, there's nothing more that can be said. It symbolizes that dissolution. But then when you chant Om, after you have closed your lips, the sound resonates. That represents the transcendent silence of the Brahman. And so the Om itself is one of the most potent symbols, most recommended for japa, as we see in the Yoga Sutra. How do you connect to this Ishvara? Tasya vachakaha pranavaha tad japaha tad artha bhavanam. Connect to this divine, to the supreme through the Omkara. Understanding, immersing yourself in its meaning. You see the Mundaka Upanishad giving us this really beautiful example. It says, Pranavo Dhanuhu. The bow is Pranava. Sharohi Atma. The Atman is the arrow, the Jivatma. With this, Brahma Tallakshanam Uchyate. Your target is Brahman, the source. Apramattena Vedhavyam, with a mind that is so collected, self-controlled. Sharavat Tanmayo Bhave. This Jivatma merges with the Paramatma. And this is the idea about the idea of using the Om as a metaphor. It becomes literally the bow with which the Atma merges with its source, the Brahman. And this Omkara, manifests innumerably. How many names? How many forms? Unfortunately, we get stuck in the forms. We get stuck in the names. And then we fight. And we say, your form is better than my form. Or my form is better than your form. But this is redundant because they're all represented of one source, that is Om. Om iti Brahma, says Taittiriya Upanishad. Om iti evedam sarvam. Everything that is manifest out of the Om. And so you see, in our supposedly mythology, we have the idea of the Trinity. What do they represent? A, U, Im represent creation, sustenance, dissolution. These are given, you could say, portfolios. They are given representations because the average mind is not capable of comprehending the abstractness of Om. How do you comprehend this Brahman? Nameless, formless, attributeless. Therefore, we are given forms to connect to. And so you have the principle of the Trimurti and the Tridevi. You have Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and correspondingly Saraswati, Mahalakshmi, and Kali or Durga or Shakti. They represent the same idea, Purusha and Prakriti, because there is the Brahman and the Shakti. There is Ishvara and Ishwari. They have to come together for life itself to continue. And so you see the symbols. You have Brahma. For the purpose of creation, knowledge becomes necessary. And so you see Brahma and Saraswati coming together as the god of creation and the goddess of knowledge. For life to sustain, one needs power. Mahavishnu is the one who is everywhere. But how can sustenance happen without wealth, without abundance? And you see how abundance marries the power of all pervasiveness in the imagery of Lakshmi Narayana. And we see again the principle of Shiva, Sadaha Shiva, and his counterpart, Shakti. It is in the dance of Shiva that the dance of the atoms lies. And when the dance of Shiva stops, life as we know it stops. And so, literally, the iconography of Shiva and Shakti, of Ardhanari, coming together represents again that cycle, ending in the dissolution, in Laya, in a return to the source. Because Shiva is Adi Yogi. He's the one who is eternally in a state of tapas for the welfare of the universe. And so beautifully, that principle of Akara, Ukara, Makara, you see, translated into the Trinity and the Tridevi. This is not merely, when we look at metaphor, this is not merely at a cosmic level. There is also metaphors within the human body. And the belief is that we are divine, we are embodied, we are divine. There is a reference in the Kathopanishad which says, Puram ekadasha dwaram ajasya vakra chetasaha anushtaya na shochati vimuktascha vimuchyate etadvai tat. The birthless one, the soul that is within, occupies a city with 11 gates, 11 openings. When you meditate on that, there is no grief, there's no dukkham. You're free from the dukkham and you're immediately free from birth. This that is within is that. The 11 openings are the eyes, the ears, the nostrils, that's 6. You have the mouth, the top of the head, the navel, the genital opening, and the anus. You have other references that speak of Navadwara Dehe. Literally, what a beautiful imagery. The body like a city, and there are gatekeepers. These are the senses that govern the different entry pathways. But there is an owner. This is the ruler, sovereign, who rules over it, and yet whose existence is independent. This is the beauty of this Sharira. And this body, Deho Devalaya Proktaha, this is a temple. Jivo Devasanatanaha, the Jiva, that which animates it is Shiva. Tyajet Ajnana Nirmalyam, give up this Ajnana, give up this covering of Ajnana. So Aham Bhavena Pujayit, so Aham Bhavena Pujayit. With this Bhavana, I am that. This is how you offer worship, where? Not externally, the temple is within. You see, similarly in the Narayana Suktam, lovely imagery of Narayana, Padma Kosha Pratikasham Hridayam Chapyadomukam Adhonishtya Vitastyante Nabhyam Uparitishthati Hridayam Tadvijaniyat Vishwasya Ayatanam Mahat. This seat of the world is, where is it? It is in a lotus bud that is in the heart space, pointing downwards in the region of the chest. Santatam Shilabhistu Lambatya Kosha Sannibham Tasyante Sushiram Sukshmam Tasmin Sarvam Pratishtitam. And within this heart space, pointing downwards like a little lotus bud, you have, it is suspended in the midst of the finest of channels, nadis. At the end of that is a subtle pathway within which is the supreme. And in the midst of this channel, Tasya Madhye Mahanagnir, there is a blazing fire, blazing in all directions, ever awake. The one who consumes the food. Santapayati swam deham apadatalastakam. This is the light that brings heat from the top to the bottom of the body. Tasya madhye vanhishika. In the midst of this, there is one flame. Aniyordhva vyavastitaha. Very subtle, atomic in nature. And in that, you see this divine flashing. Neelato yada madhyastad vidyulle keva baswata, like a streak of lightning in the midst of storm clouds. Nivara shuka vattanvi pita bhasvatya nopama, like the tip of the grain that peeps through the husk. In that manner is this self-luminous divine, visible, enshrined within the layers of this body. Tasyaha shikhaya madhye paramatma vyavastitaha. The supreme is established in that, in the middle of that flame. Sabrahma Sashiva Sendra Sokshara Paramaswarat. This indeed is the supreme, the imperishable ruler. What a beautiful imagery for the heart where the divine resides. And we see that the body has always been considered to be a temple. As Tirumular says, Ullam Perankovil, Un Udamba Alayam, Vallal Piranarku Vai Gopura Vasal, Tellat Telindarku Jeevan, Sivalingam, Kalla Pulanaindum, Kala Manivilakke. This is the Tirumandiram. It says your body is the temple, a place where the divine resides. It is the abode of consciousness. The mouth, the ones who are wise, for their mouth, it is the Gopura, the entrance to the temple. This is where you pass through to reach the sanctum. The Jiva is Shiva. Our senses are like lamps that illumine our experiences, but when you direct them inwards, they illuminate the Garbhagraha, the sanctum sanctorum of the Supreme. And so you have temple architecture. It's not random. The construction of the temple is literally seen as the human form. And there are ideas from Vastu Shastra that present so beautifully how the subtle body with its 7 chakras is literally brought about in the construction of the temple, from the Gopuram till the Garbhagraham, the Vimana above. You can literally superimpose it on the subtle anatomy. This is such a beautiful living metaphor. The temple itself is a living metaphor, not merely a random construct. And even in the way that you move through a temple, even there is a symbolism. For you move through every outer prakara, every courtyard. The lavish decorations, ornamentations are on the outside. You experience them, but then you go to the heart. And the heart of the temple is, you will see, small, dimly lit, because this is the heart of the entire cosmos. It represents the heart of the self. And so while there is ornamentation on the outside, this is the world of matter, much to delight in. But you don't stop there. You don't go to a temple to see the courtyards. You go to a temple to offer your worship at the very heart. As the Kathopanishad says, Anoraniyan Mahato Mahiyan Atmasya Jantor Nihito Guhayam. This which is larger than the largest, tinier than the tiniest, where is it? It is inside the cave of the heart. Tamakratu Pashyati Vita Shoko Datu Prasadan Mahimanam Atmanaha. And there, when the one who realizes the glory of the Atman outside in the temple, and then within, in the space of the heart, such a person is Vita Shoka, free from grief. And so merely visiting a temple is not merely a religious practice, it's a deeply spiritual practice that is an outer ritual to show you the way to the divine that lights up the cave of your own heart. Then we come to the metaphor of the chariot in the Kathopanishad, where it says the self, the Atma, is the Rathinam Vidhi, Shariram Rathamevacha, Buddhim tu Saratim Vidhi, Manak Pragrahamevacha. It says the Atma is the master of the chariot, the body is the chariot, the Buddhi is the charioteer, the mind, the bridle, the reins. The organs, the Indriyani, are the horses. The Vishaya, the objects of the senses, are the pathways on which the horse runs. That which enjoys all of this is the Bhokta, the source. However, the Kathopanishad says, how does this chariot run? It should run on its road, it should not deviate. When the sense organs, like horses, they are devoid of discrimination. If you give horses free rein, they will run wild, they'll pull apart the chariot. And so the senses that are uncontrolled are unruly when the horses are not controlled. But when the intellect that is associated with a restrained mind has discernment and it controls the senses, then the horses are disciplined and they run on the pathway without deviation. The one who does not, when this Atma, when the Jivatma is associated with the body, mind, senses complex that is not controlled, not restrained, then it is tainted, it is trapped and returns to the cycle of birth, life and death. But that Atma that is supported by a buddhi of impeccable clarity, a mind that is controlled, for such an Atma, that Jivatma is free. There is no further return to samsara, says the Kathopanishad. And so it highlights the importance of bringing about a charioteer, a discerning intellect. That is the buddhi that controls the mind, and that chariot alone reaches the Paramam Gatim, the Paramam Padam, the abode of Vishnu. Now, what is it that binds us? It is our mind. And as the Bhagavad Gita tells us, what is the source of this dukkham? Kama esha, krodha esha, rajoguna samudbhavaha. These are the forms, the kleshas, raga, dvesha. These are the kleshas that bind us. Parallelly, you see such a beautiful reference in the Lalita Sahasranama, where the goddess is represented with all these ornaments. She holds the noose on one hand and the ankusha, the goad, on the other. Raga swarupa pashadya. The raga, our desires, are like pashas. They are like nooses that tie us. Krodha karam kushojjvala. The ankusha is of the form of anger. Kama and Krodha go hand in hand. They lead us to the pathway of destruction. But how do you control it? Mano Rupa Ikshu Kodanda. She holds in her hand the sugarcane bow, representing the mind that is under the control. And Pancha Tanmatra Shayaka. So her arrows are the elements. They are the Pancha Tanmatras. And so the mind that has gained control controls not only the world outside, it also controls the inner mind. And this is the pathway. In Srividya, the Devi is worshipped because she is the one who can break us free from the noose. And so she holds in her hand these weapons that help us to transcend by controlling the mind. The Gita has a slight reverse of the same chariot metaphor, where the charioteer now is Krishna. The one who's sitting on the chariot is Arjuna. He's seeking clarity. And so here in the Bhagavad Gita, you see a difference. The Bhagavad Gita itself is a metaphor for our lives, and Arjuna speaks for us. Because our conflict is Arjuna's conflict, the eternal conflict between dharma and adharma. And so here you see the reversal, where Krishna becomes the wise teacher, always clear, always knowing the path of dharma, guiding Arjuna through the battlefield of his own mind. And so Krishna here is the Yogeshwara, Nimitta Karana, Ishwara of the Yoga Sutra, and Arjuna is the Nirmana Chitta, who is attempting to be transformed. So this is again a very beautiful metaphor, slightly different from the Kathopanishad, but here the idea of Krishna as Purusha, who is able to, representing that evolved mind, the teacher mind, who is able to detach from worldly preoccupations, who has realized the truth and thus is capable of guiding others on this pathway. And this is why, under Krishna's guidance, at the very end of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna says, Nashto mohaha smriti labdha labdhva tvat prasadan maya achyuta stitosmi gata sandeha karishye vachanam tava. He says, now I will take up arms. I will do what you say because my moha has been dispelled. This is the role of the Guru, the teacher, who leads us to that clarity. You have another idea when we speak of the body, the Panchakosha Prakriya, where you have the Pakshi Kalpana, the symbolism of the bird, the Panchamayas represented as birds, representing the complexity of the human system and showing us how this Atma is bound, it's trapped within the Panchamaya. But the Prakriya itself is an Upaya, it's a way of realizing that there is the self that is within, there are many layers. But when you understand that the self pervades and permeates every layer, you realize that all these Panchamayas are but limitations. And what is eternal is the realization, is the Atma within. And in that moment of realization is when one is truly free. So this is another beautiful metaphor that comes through in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Coming to stories, very often we dismiss our stories as merely stories. You see that stories have deeper truths, not myth, not mythology, but very beautiful allegorical tapestries. You see this in the churning of the Samudra Manthana. I think the story is familiar. The ocean itself represents the churning of our lives, in which you need a point of stasis represented by the Mandhara. You have the Devas and the Asuras churning. The divine and the demonic, where are they? They are inside us. They are inside of our mind. And Vasuki is the rope that binds, representing our desires that have to be controlled. So you have Meru or Mandhara as the center. You have the Devas and Asuras churning. And you have Mahavishnu appearing as Kurma, giving us stability. You need that stability. You need an Adhara. And who better to be an Adhara than this Ishvara? And as they churn, there is the halahla, the poison, toxic. Naturally, when you churn the mind, the inner depths of your mind are churned. It's obviously the toxicities that come out, for which you need someone who will consume this. And there Shiva appears, Mahadeva appears as the Adi Guru. He consumes the poison so that it doesn't harm us, so that we continue in our journey. And then you see that the 14 Ratnas emerge from the depths of the ocean. And last to it, they represent all the virtuous qualities, the powers, the potentials of the mind that happen as we continue this process of churn and transformation. Last to emerge is Amrita. This is this knowledge that we are seeking. But even there, one can be deluded, which is why Vishnu appears as Mohini, dilutes the Asuras and gives the Amrita to the Devas. Amrita is nothing but Jnana, the knowledge of the eternal truth. And so in the midst of that battle of the divine and the demonic, you see so many hidden allegories that are represented. I can go on about the story itself for over an hour. I'm just giving you the ideas behind these stories. Similarly, when you look at the Devi Mahatmya, the text itself is metaphor. The entire text is metaphor. It starts with the quest of Suratha and Samadhi, who seek the wisdom of sage Medha. And then you have the Saptashati, the Durga Saptashati is 13 chapters, 700 verses. And you see the three parts. You have the destruction of Madhu and Kaitaba, you have the slaying of Mahisha, and finally Shumba and Nishumba. You see here the liberation of the Jivatma from its entanglements, from its embodiment. This is the source. This is our purpose. It has to finally reach its destination. As humans, we are trapped. We are intellectually trapped. We are trapped by our delusion and the pursuit of pleasure and pain. Repeated loops. This is caused by Rajas and Tamas. Now, the destruction of Madhu and Kaitapa represent the tendency, because this Madhu and Kaitaba represent the tendency to experience constant pleasure. We seek pleasure, and so they indicate our avidya caused by Rajas and Tamas. So first, Rajas and Tamas have to come down, and therefore you see Brahma appealing to Mahavishnu to waken up, appealing to Vishnu as Ishvara to destroy the demons Madhu and Kaitaba. And you see that the awakening of Vishnu is the dawn of the Buddhi. And they are these demons that are trapped by their delusion. They seek the boon. And they say that you will have to kill us. And so Vishnu kills them. And then you see now when Rajas and Tamas has come down, the pathway to our spiritual growth has been open. And all the undesirable tendencies of the sense-dominated manas that have been aroused they are starting. There is a struggle. This is represented by the various battles that you see in the Devi Mahatmyam. Initially, the ego dominates until one realizes that the highest mastery comes with the unwavering Shraddha. And so, first Tamas, you have to root out Tamas, which is why Mahisha is killed. And then you have the tug of war between the divine and the demonic. The forces of the Devas and the Asuras are battling. And you see Durga seated astride Rajoguna, that lion representing Dharma. She represents Dharma. The lion represents Dharma. She charges into battle to destroy the Rajas that is present. And so you see that Mahisha represents the destruction of Tamas. The battle itself, where the forces of Devi and the forces of Mahisha clash. And that is when Tamas comes down, and then the sadhana truly begins. But the story doesn't end, because there are so many obstacles that come up. The demons that ride into battle represent the Ashtapasha, the 8 fetters that bind us. And so when these are destroyed, then you have Raktabija, the ego arising repeatedly, who tries. The Raktabija is the one where from every drop of his blood, another Asura emerges. And that ego needs to be subsumed, consumed in entirety. And therefore, you have a Chandika, you have a Kali, uprooting that final, the seeds of ego. Because even there you have this ahamkara and mamakara that have to be annihilated. That is represented by Shumba and Nishumba. And this is where you see Devi utters the humkara, and she just decimates Shumba's forces, the power of mantra. And then finally Shumba and Nishumba are killed. And then the Jivatma merges with the Paramatma, indicating how the ultimate pathway happens. She is showered praises by the assembled yoga, the Devis, by the Devas and the sages who shower her with praises. And so she grants boons to Surata and Samadhi, indicating Bhoga and Apavarga, because Surata goes back to rule his kingdom, and the other one, the seeker Samadhi, attains Apavarga, attains the state of Brahmajnana. And so you see that the entire battle itself is an allegory for yoga sadhana, for our movement from the material into the spiritual. Similarly, the Ganga, the descent of the Ganga, she's no ordinary river, because the Ganga is an emotion. All our rivers are emotions. They are very deep. And so it's not merely a river. It's something held with the utmost esteem. And the story, the descent of the Ganga, is again allegorical, where you see, we know the story. I'm not going into the story, but Sagara represents the mind and the horses, the horse sacrifice. The horse is sent to Rome, representing the senses. Sagara is wedded to Sumati, literally right thinking, a good mind. And where is this playing out? It's playing out on the earth. But then we know what happens. The horse disappears. The 60,000 sons of Sagara go to claim the horses, and they go to the Patala, where they see Kapila meditating. And the sons of Sagara are literally the vrittis of the mind. They don't realize the nobility of the sage, don't realize that he cannot have stolen the horse. So they try to attack him. And in the process, they are cursed. And so Kapila represents the cycle of karma. But then for generations, for so many generations, these 60,000 sons don't attain their Atma Shanti. And it takes a Bhagirata. After many, many generations, there's a Bhagirata who prays for the descent of Ganga. And Ganga represents that jnana of Atma. And therefore, again, you need Shiva. Shiva appearing as an intermediary, as the Jagadguru, who receives and transmits the light of knowledge to Bhagirata, who represents every one of us. And where is this Ganga coming from? Her source is Vishnupadi. She is the very immortal source of Amrita. And so you see that is what we are seeking. Both Sagara and his sons represent that quest for power, mastery over the material. The sons pay the price for their arrogance. Bhagirata represents a unique sadhaka. He realizes the need for sadhana. His tapas runs into thousands of years. He is the representative of Abhyasa, Vairagya and Shraddha. And as an outcome of his sadhana, Brahma Vidya descends in the form of Ganga. And Shiva represents the Guru Tattvam, because you can't handle it. The human mind is not capable of comprehending the magnificence of Brahman. And so you need the Guru to receive and to give. And so Ganga emerges and she flows as a timeless prana, as who leads us back to the source. She is the purifier, most pure. Pavani Gange. She is the one who herself is pure, and the one who purifies everybody else. And so within this simple idea of a river yatra is so much of symbolism. Coming to cultural practices, so many practices. I'll just quickly take you through some that are common. One is the lamp. The lamp is a symbol you will see everywhere in the length and breadth of India, but it's made up fundamentally of an earthen or a metallic vessel. Then you have the wick and you have the flame. And we see that it represents the vessel itself represents the Panchabhuta. You have the oil that represents Vasanas. The wick represents our Asmita, the ego. And the flame is the kindling of Jnana. As the lamp burns, it burns away the Vasanas and the ego. And in fact, also the idea of Sattva. Sattva Guna Pradhanam is there. The lamp itself is a repository of Sattva Guna. Oil lamps, specifically lamps lit with sesame oil or mahua oil, are known to release certain chemicals that are known to purify the atmosphere. And we see that in the Yoga Rahasya of Krishnamacharya, he also speaks about how the oil, wick and vessel come together and they give birth to light. In the same way, the practice of yoga gives us good health so that the light within can shine. This is a very beautiful connection that Krishnamacharya makes with regard to the light of the lamp. You have other practices, whether it's the offering of flowers. These flowers that delight your senses, you pluck them with your fingers. The fingers represent the senses. You use them not to adorn yourself. You use them as offerings. You give them back. So it's a way of redirecting the senses towards the redirecting the senses towards the divine. The breaking of coconuts, not a wasteful practice. It represents the destruction of ego. Because the hard outer shell is broken, the white inner flesh represents that purity of ego. And therefore, at the beginning of any task, it is customary to break coconuts, saying that, let me embark on this. Let this task be blessed. Let me do it without being attached. Let this ahamkara and mamakara that are my enemies, let them be removed. Similarly, the arti that you show is the camphor is a symbol of sublimating the self, because camphor is a substance. It comes from the sap of a tree that is sublimating. It self-sublimates. It basically burns itself. When it burns, there's nothing left. That is the idea of sublimating the body, the mind, the ahamkara in the service of the Atma. So within these practices, you see embedded the subtle metaphor. Another very common metaphor, you have Krishna referred to as Makhan Chor, the stealer of butter. Why does he steal butter? For the simple reason that even the very process of making ghee itself is symbolic of an inner transformation. Because ghee is among the most precious of commodities, known for its ability to increase ojas. And if you look at the price of milk, milk might sell for maybe, organic milk might sell for 60 rupees a liter or 80 rupees a liter. But you buy 1 liter of ghee, you have to pay at least 1,000 rupees. Why? Because it goes through a process. And so milk has to become curd. It transforms into an entirely different substance, curd, by the addition of some kind of a substance that will curdle the milk. And then that curd has to be churned. This is the process of churning buttermilk. And then the butter separates. It comes to the top. The way the water settles in the bottom, that butter further has to be heated until it becomes ghee. And it is this butter that Krishna steals, because this is the butter represents that purity of the heart, that heart of the mind that is devoid of ego, that has allowed itself to be transformed in this process of churning and is of the finest quality. That is what Krishna steals. He steals the butter of our hearts, and then he subjects it to a process of further heating. The tapas that comes through the sadhana of bhakti transforms butter into ghee. Ghee is most potent. It doesn't go bad. It never spoils. Rich in ojas, rich in vitality. And so this is the transformation that happens even in a simple process, the process of churning buttermilk to gain ghee, butter, and then to make ghee. So beautifully, you see how it can be correlated to spiritual sadhana and the final process of sublimating oneself by offering the butter of your heart to the Ishvara. Similarly, Tirtha Yatras. We understand, in fact, when you look at Varanasi, Varanasi lies at the confluence of two rivers. This is externally, this is geographically. But the inner pilgrimage is very important, because Ida and Pingala that flow within the body represent the two rivers, Varuna and Asi, and the point where they merge here is considered to be Varanasi. And so you have the external pilgrimage, which is all right, but where is it leading you to? In that dipping of in the Ganga, the mind has to be attuned to the process of the inner Tirtha Yatra, where Varanasi, Kashi Kshetra, is where Vishwanatha, the ruler of the universe, reigns at Varanasi. Where is this? It's not outside, it's inside. And so very beautifully you have this reference of Varanasi being the inner conjunction point of Ida and Pingala. And when you reflect here, you merge with this idea of Ishvara, Ishvari. Similarly, Mahashivaratri as a festival. Why do you stay awake through the night? Because it is a representation of conquering tamas. That sleep is ignorance. Through the night, it's conquering the night of ignorance so that a renewed clarity may dawn, that sattva dawns in all its splendor. This is why Shivaratri becomes such a very celebrated festival in this tradition. Another cultural practice, the offering of arghyam. We pour water. I think in any river across the length and breadth of India, when you go in the morning or evening, you will see people offering water. This traces back to a very beautiful story narrated in the Taittiriya Aranyaka, where the story says that there are the Devas and there are a group of Asuras called Mandeha Asuras, and they inhabit a certain island called Aruni. Literally, Mandeha. The mind and the body, within this body and mind are the demonic forces. What do they try to do? They arise every morning. They try to obscure the light of the sun. They try to capture the sun's light and prevent the light from being received by the Devas and the world. They want to destroy. These are the forces of ignorance. And so the gods go to the creator and he gives them the Upadesha. He says, offer arghyam, offer water to the sun, chanting the Gayatri mantra. And as you throw this water, or as you offer the water to the sun, this water that is potentized with the mantra will literally dispel the Asura hordes, and they are forced to retreat to their island again. This is the symbol behind the chanting of the Gayatri mantra. Offering of the arghyam is not merely a random or mechanical ritual. You offer it with this prayer. Let these demonic forces that darken my mind, that prevent me from seeing light, let them be destroyed. It is with that prayer that we offer the arghyam. Certain other metaphors, very quickly, before I conclude. The lotus, timeless metaphor, as the Gita says, Padma Patra Iva Ambhasa. How should we be? How should we function? What is the, you could say, the pinnacle of yoga sadhana is Vairagya. And how is this Vairagya? It is like water droplets on a lotus leaf, that the lotus is rooted in slushy, dirty water, but it rises above and it is untouched. Its leaves have an oily coating. No matter how much water falls, the leaf is not tainted by the water. This is the idea of a sadhaka. How should I be? You are in and of this world. You still have to do your dharma. As Krishna says, do the dharma, do your karma, but do it without attachment. Do it with vairagyam. And so the lotus itself becomes a symbol for transcendence from the material into the spiritual. Again, word and meaning, inseparable. So many metaphors. And now I come to the heart, or I could say the conclusion of this lecture. I'm taking just 2 words. We'll see. If time permits, I'll quickly speak of one more. The first is Hridaya. Hridayam. We loosely say heart. Is this merely the beating heart? In the Indian context, Hridayam tat vijaniyat vishwasya ayatanam mahad. This Hridayam, this heart space, is the abode of what? Vishwasya ayatanam, the very source of the universe. Now, coming to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it gives us such a beautiful idea of what Hridaya is. Hri iti ekam aksharam abhiharanti. What does Hri do? It is that which draws towards oneself. Draws, it compels everything to move towards it. This is one of the functions of the heart. It draws the impure blood from everywhere into it. This is also the attribute of the Brahman. It is all encompassing. It draws everything into it. That is the purpose of merging. Laya is laya into the Paramatma. So Hri represents that drawing inwards. Da, the syllable da iti ekam aksharam dadatyasmai. It is to give, dadati. Its meaning is to give. And the heart, the physical heart pumps. It pumps blood that feeds the entire body. But when you look at the Brahman heart, it is from that source that the entire world emerges. And then yam indicates movement. This is a cycle that the physical heart represents. You could say the heart center is what is keeping life processes continuing, because otherwise you take this away, take away the hridaya, take away the prana, what is left is only a corpse. And so indicates movement. And therefore you see that the from the source of the Brahman, there is a movement into the manifest world. Again, there is a return to the source. This idea is what underpins that terminology Hridayam. Now, if we were merely to translate Hridaya as heart, it's a gross disservice, because the word heart cannot truly communicate what Hri, Da and Ya indicate. Another word, very relevant in our present context today, because this is Guru Purnima, the day in which all the teachers are honored. It is celebrated as Vyasa Purnima, because Vyasa is the one who has given to us the Vedas, who compiled the Vedas and gave it to them in a form that is till today followed. But Vyasa Purnima is also the day to celebrate the entire Guru Mandala. Now, why is the Guru important? We've seen through the narratives of the Samudra Manthana, we have seen in the descent of the Ganga. In every situation, the Guru becomes extremely important, because our ordinary eyes are not capable of seeing the truth of Brahman. We need to be given that vision. This also happens in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna as Jagat Guru gives special Jnana Chakshu to Arjuna for him to see the true form of Ishvara. It is only after that Arjuna says, "This, I cannot take this form. Achyuta, please restore my original eyesight." That happens later. But that opening of the inner eye of wisdom is the role of the Guru. This is also the reason why not every teacher is a Guru. And I think this is something we need to understand very clearly, especially on the occasion of Guru Purnima. Who is a Guru? You can have teachers, you can have acharyas. Acharyas are those who are adept in some skills, they possess knowledge and they transmit that knowledge. They also walk the path with you. While a guru can be an acharya, not every acharya is a guru. Not every teacher can claim to be a guru. And therefore, in this context, it's important, very important, not to label ourselves self-styled gurus, self-styled yogis, rishis, Kali Yuga Rishi, Kali Yuga Yoga Rishi. These are, I'm sorry to say, are among the worst appropriations that we see, because in no way are we qualified to call ourselves gurus. We might at best be teachers. We are transmitters of some knowledge, possibly vessels. Even that you have to make yourself a worthy vessel to receive and to pass. Who is this guru? The guru Shabda itself is so beautiful. Gukaras Chandakaro hi Rukaras Teja Uchyate. Gu represents Andakara, darkness. Ru represents light. Ajnana Nashakam Brahma Gurureva na Samshayaha. This guru is the Brahman, the supreme. What does the guru do? Removes the ajnana. The darkness is removed and light dawns with the grace of the guru. Gukaras Chandakarastu Rukaras Tannirodakrit. Gukara represents the andhakara, the darkness of ignorance. Rukara, Ru represents the one who is capable of dispelling this darkness. Andhakara vinashatvat gurur ityabhidiyate. The guru is one who is capable of instantaneously removing, dispelling the darkness of avidya and awakening us to the light that shines within. Gukarascha gunatito rupatito rukaraha. Gu represents the one who transcends the gunas. Ru represents the one who is rupatita, who has no form. Guna rupa vihinatvat guru rityabhidiyate. A true guru is one who transcends the gunas and who's not limited to name, form, space, or time. Gukara pratamo varno mayadi gunabhasakaha. Rukarasti param brahma maya bhranta vimochakam. Gu represents maya, the darkness. Varna, that sound is the darkness that maya causes. Rukarasti param brahma. Ru represents that power of the Brahman. Maya bhranta vimochakam. That in that moment of illumination, it dispels the clouding of maya. Gukaram cha gunatitam rukaram rupavarjitam. Similar idea. The guru is the one who is himself gunatita, beyond the gunas. Rupavarjitam, has no form. And yet, guna atitam arupam cha yo dadyatsa guru smritaha. Who is the guru? The guru is the one who is capable of elevating us ordinary mortals who are so limited by the three gunas, who are so conditioned by space, form, time. The one who helps us to transcend these limitations, to become gunatita and arupa. They become catalysts for the highest level of spiritual transformation. And so this is a very beautiful idea, that in that word guru, there are so many shades of meaning that are hidden that we need to acknowledge. And so I conclude this talk offering my heartfelt salutations to the Jnana Parampara, to the timeless teachings of these masters who have continued time and time again. As Krishna says, Paritranaya sadhunam vinashaya cha dushkritam dharma samsthapanarthaya sambhavami yuge yuge. In every era, in every generation, so many avatars, so many mahapurushas, so many siddhas, so many mahatmas. Who are they? They are all Ishvara Swarupa. They are here to protect us, to give protection to the noble, for the destruction, vinashaya cha dushkritam, dharma samsthapanarthaya, for the re-establishment of dharma. It is to that guru principle, that guru tattva, that shows us the paths to the divine, who shows us the way back to our source. Because we have come far away. If you go back to my first part of the lecture, the Ashwatha tree, we are so enmeshed in the branches, but we need to go back to the source. Who will lead you? There are smritis, there are shrutis, there are puranas, there are itihasas. But you need someone who will interpret these, who will teach this so that our limited minds can understand. Ajnana timirandhasya jnananjana shalakaya chakshur unmilitam yena tasmai shri gurave namaha. Ajnana timirandhasya, that frightful darkness of ajnana has to be dispelled. Your eyes open, you engage with the world, but unfortunately, this is the world of avidya, this is the world of maya. What does the Guru do? Jnananjana shalakaya. He applies on our eyes the collyrium, the kajal of jnana. And now there is a new vision. You see a vision that is previously unseen, the Yaugika Pratyaksha. This is the Guru who himself, Chakshur Unmilitam, the teacher, the true teacher, the Guru, the Dakshinamurti, the Ishvara principle. In all representations, you will see with eyes half open, half closed. Why half open, half closed? Present in this world as Jivan Muktas, and yet vision directed inwards towards the Atma. This is the truth that these gurus embody. Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. And so, with my heartfelt salutations to this Jnana Parampara, who have kept alive a fascinating world of symbol, have given us so much of insight into the hidden depths of these symbolisms, of these metaphors. I offer my salutations to the Guru Parampara and end with this heartfelt prayer that we learn to look beyond the surface, to look beyond appearances, and to reach out, to hold, to embrace the very heart of Indian thought, of Sanatana Samskriti, so that we truly resonate in this Brahmananda, which is the source. Thank you very much, and namaskar.
Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for this whole journey of symbols and metaphors that you took us through. And I think this was the whole plethora of examples that you covered from the Shruti text and from the Upanishads and the examples, then going on to the Puranic literature and the stories from them, and then coming to our day-to-day lives. I think you just covered the whole spectrum. And when you were talking about Ganga, I almost got goosebumps that isn't it so, we're so blessed to be in presence of that river, be by its side, knowing this whole anecdote that you told, the whole how it emerged and what it symbolizes. It's just truly feels so, you just feel so blessed to exist in this time, in this land, everything. And so some examples like visiting the temple and the process of moving into your own Hriday Guha or the heart cave. We see a lot of people who say that I am spiritual, but I am not religious. They'll come to the temple at the gate, but they will not enter inside. So I think this is a good insight for them that this whole process, so where we try to, with our limited buddhi, separate this spiritual versus religious, we just make them two boxes. So when we integrate and understand how profound it could be. Another beautiful, I think, the metaphor, what was it? Yes, the you were talking about the chariot and the charioteer, and how in different examples the metaphors could reverse, and yet with your Viveka Buddhi, both sides, it is so profound. So in Dr. Frawley, Vamadev ji's talk last week, he was also talking of Agni and Soma and how, depending on the context, they could switch their positions or their meanings. So, one more thing that struck me was what beautiful part about this whole symbolism is that it is not mere story or a surface level or a blind belief kind of a thing, but you have to use your Viveka Buddhi, interpret them correctly. Otherwise, again, it can lead to wrong interpretations.
Yes, that is the danger with all these symbols.
And yeah, so when you talked about, so while we are talking about misappropriation of yoga, I also see a misappropriation of this symbolism itself. So in the West, without understanding, so they have this Ganesha t-shirts and this
Exactly.
mats, and what they say is that it's a freedom of choice. But what I feel is that if your choice is disrespectful to some, then that claiming of the freedom really needs to be evaluated.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is, in fact, I have even seen pictures of Ganesha, of Radha, Krishna on toilet walls, restroom walls in yoga studios. In fact, it was thankfully someone I knew, and I said, you can hang it elsewhere, never in the toilet. Because I can, in the name of freedom, I can do anything. It doesn't make it right. That there is value, there is sanctity to that, and I think it's extremely important that we take a stand against putting om symbol on yoga mats, Ganesha symbols on yoga mats, and then you step on it.
Yes.
When we just set foot on the earth in the morning, there is such a beautiful kshama, there's a prarthana, the bhumi sparshana kshama, where we say pada sparsham kshamaswame. We are praying to Bhuma Devi, and you're saying, please forgive me for trampling upon you. If that is the regard given to an inert element, that is the same regard given to everything, because everything is Brahman, Sarvam Brahman.
Yeah.
Unless that spirit is seen, I'm afraid there will be no end to appropriation and misappropriation.
Misappropriation. Yeah. So then, talking about these core values, I think when you started off the talk, you mentioned about these practices of values, and then the rituals and the personalities and the symbols. How do we enlighten the younger generation of this remarkable tradition and its richness? So, like, do we go reverse to reach this, like, starting from the symbol? That's where their
Yes,
questions arise.
you have
Then
to
to the
start from this.
personalities. What I've seen is that in between, before we reach the values, that ritual part is where somewhere they get put off. How do we cross this barrier?
See, the ritual is a very important bridge to the spiritual. Because if you look at all our rituals, you have to be present mentally. There is no question of doing a ritual mindlessly. They require incredible concentration, attention, nuances, attention to detail. And so the rituals are a way of, you could say, pacifying the senses that are constantly, looking out, going outwards. You reduce the agitation of the senses, draw the mind inwards. So in a sense, I would say the rituals are essential to bring about a pratyahara state of mind. Only then you're even ready for dharana. Until then, we are not ready. Which is why you start at the symbol. You look at the personalities, because it's through the personalities that you learn yama niyama. Even if you look at the Ashtanga, Patanjali, even though it says Samadhi Pada, we know Yoga Sutra, the goal is Tada Drashtuhu Swarupe Avasthanam. We know the goal is Kaivalyam. He's not starting there. When he speaks of Ashtanga, he says Yama first. You start first getting your relationships in order, your all kinds of engagements in order. Then work on yourself from Yama, from the outside to Niyama, to what you do for yourself. Then you prepare your body. There is asana, there is pranayama. When all of this is done, then it lays the foundation for pratyahara. Pratyahara is what gives you eligibility for dharana, and then it doesn't stop. The sadhana continues all the way till Nirbija Samadhi. Now, our problem is that we dismiss rituals because many of the times we don't want to take the time to find out why. Why do people do a Karwa Chauth? Why do people? Is it merely a misogynistic something, a ritual where the women are ill-treated, that they have to fast the whole day? I don't think you can dismiss it like that. Is an Ekadashi Vrata something that you dismiss? Is a Navaratri something that you dismiss? Is Deepavali merely a festival of, lighting lamps or bursting crackers or wearing new clothes or eating good food? No, there is a deeper symbolism. You take the Pongal, you take the harvest festivals. In Bihu, in the Pongal traditions, it's not like other festivals. See, you have to look at nuance. In Pongal, see, normally in Indian households, you're told don't waste food. But in Pongal, you have to let the pot overflow. It has to overflow. Why? Because it represents that fulfillment. It's coming into abundance. And so you're invoking a harvest that brings abundance for everyone. So every festival has its own nuances. You take the Navaratris that happen 4 times a year, 6 times a year. We just finished Ashadha Navaratri. And so you see the Navaratri itself is symbolism. Everything you look around, you look at the rangolis, you look at the little practices. Why do you offer food to the crows? Everything is symbolic. Unless you take a little time, find out why. Ask people who know. Don't dismiss it. I stand against dismissing something simply because I can't be bothered to find out. Find out about it. Make the effort. And then you come to a decision. But my life experience is that the ritual leads you into the spiritual. You need to engage your senses. You need to engage your hands. Need to engage the different organs of your body. Then you come to sublimation. That is the path.
Yeah. So gradually, step by step,
Yes.
people are led into that. They want to directly dive, and that's not going to happen.
Not going to happen at all.
Yeah. But yeah, so now the thing is, what you said, it was very insightful, ignited a spark within us to dive deeper. Where to go and ask? So for this is also a question that I often receive, that our parents may be no lesser than our grandparents, and maybe I know lesser than them to be able to transmit to the next generation. So where is the place to clarify this doubt? So maybe reaching out to you at KYM, or what would be the advised route?
There are so many acharyas, so many, I would say, very great scholars. I mean, you have featured some remarkable people in Bilva, in Damrus, in the festival itself, across India. I mean, is there a center in India where there is no access to scholarship? Any city you go, there are people, there are scholars, there are people. Also, what I must say here is that this is one end. You have the Jnana Parampara, where it is established through a process of study, of scholarship, of knowledge of indigenous literature and Samskrita and other languages. But also at the very grassroots level, the symbols are in our practices. They are there in our folk songs. They are there in our lullabies. They are there in the stories. And so also that is the other level where we stop looking at these as merely stories. You know, there's this very beautiful story that comes in the Prashnopanishad. Basically, the story is about a debate between the different sense organs and prana. And each of these organs is fighting and saying, I am superior. And finally, prana establishes its superiority. Now, it's easy to dismiss, and you can say, oh, how silly, this is a child's tale. How can the senses fight? That is not the point. It's an allegory. Look at what is lying beneath. So access stories. In fact, I would say don't read abridged versions. Read the full version. If you can, read it in the original. If you can't read it in an original, go for a complete unabridged translation where there's at least word-to-word translations. That way you'll see what depth is there, because stories are not merely something to entertain. They are to elevate. And that is what we need to look at. And it is there in our folk parampara. You don't have to go to the Jnana Parampara. That's one end. But the other end is the folk parampara, the Loka Parampara. The simple practices. Why do you bathe in the Ganga? Why do you bathe in any river? Is it merely a sense of regard for nature? It's not that. There is there is an eco-friendly aspect to it. But there is also a subtler aspect to what that process, that is a sadhana. The yatra itself, there's so much preparation. You go as a pilgrimage. You go with a certain bhavana. And then you dip. It's not like, you wear a swimsuit or you wear a bikini and you go to the Ganga. You cannot. It is not possible. Because the Ganga evokes that emotion. That is what we look for. In these small festivals, is there anything that is not worshipped in our culture? You go to the villages, they have trees that are draped with saris. You take the custom of offering the Narmada sari. What a beautiful custom that is. The sari is not for us. The sari, it is a gesture. She is the mother who's giving life. And so we are offering our gratitude by draping her with a vastra. So when you look at those little, the cultural paramparas, what exists in our folk traditions, I think there also there's abundant knowledge to be again. And in the wisdom, in the Subhashitas, in the proverbs that have passed into our local languages, in that there is so much wisdom if you just take time to look at it.
I think there is not even a single inch of the fabric of our parampara where it is not a knowledge tradition, or where it is just simply for entertainment. It's always multi-layered. just need
And
to go
even if
deeper.
it's entertaining, there is an aesthetic component. You cannot take rasa out of it, because rasanubhava, which is Indian aesthetics, what is it? It is Sahridayatvam. The heart resonates with the heart of the performer, with the writer, with the sculptor. If that is not yoga, what is yoga? That is also yoga. That is dhyana. And so you'll see they all come together under the umbrella of rasa. When you say in the Upanishad, raso vai saha, there is one that is the source. But everything else is to be enjoyed. It is to be delighted in. When you delight in it, you learn about it.
That's where you dwell in that ananda.
Yes.
But talking of aesthetic, maybe one last question that came to my mind. This whole symbolism that you explained about this yogi sitting on a hamsa, which is Omkara itself, it is such a beautiful symbol, profound and beautiful. So it's like not only does it have a very beautiful sense of aesthetic, if you like imagine hamsa and a yogi sitting on it, and then the meaning part of it. So
Yes.
we don't need to compare, but something comes to my mind that do you see any such metaphors, aesthetic and knowledge, in this modern times? I mean, do we see anything? Do these metaphors continue to surround us today in our context of modern lifestyles?
I honestly don't know. I think there are some seekers who do look for a metaphor around us. People who write poems, with, I would say, someone who's creatively inspired is able to see the hidden truth in everything. In the flight of birds, what flight represents, what does it mean to fly? What is represented by the dawn when sun arises? Literally the darkness goes away, but what is it doing to me emotionally? There is metaphor. There's metaphor in the waves of the ocean, in the depths of the ocean. You see the most beautiful worlds beneath the ocean, but that ocean floor, it's a lot of effort to go there. So I think you can train yourself, but then unfortunately we also tend to be very literal minded, and we have no time or patience to stop. I think, there's this poem, I'm not sure who the author is. What life is this if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. Literally, that's where we are. We are running all the time. But if we could just stop and look, I think we will start resonating, because there's only one rhythm. You can't but see that truth in everything, but you have to allow yourself to see it.
So they're there, they're all around. It's just that we have to train ourselves or just start
Yes.
seeing them.
And we have to see value. Nothing is, to be dismissed. Everything has value. So that is the vision we need.
I think just by training in that, by adding this or seeking value in everything, every experience, that in itself enriches our lives so much. And that is the process of yoga. You've taken within
Absolutely.
gradually. What a wonderful discussion that you generated today. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you
Most
so
welcome,
much.
Amrit.
Yeah, it was amazing. Um, so I would also like to thank you, all the viewers who are with us right now. And I really know that you enjoyed this treat of journey through these symbols and metaphors. Tomorrow, again, we will be meeting with another very lively personality, Dr. Ananda Balayoga Bhavanani, and he is very, very vocal about these misappropriations happening. So do not miss tomorrow. Do join us at 7:30 p.m. India time. And till then, we will meet again. Thank you.